Burke, Cardinal Raymond Leo. Wisconsin Cardinal Raymond Burke, 76, is a vocal admirer of Trump. He has a history of conflict with Pope Francis and is considered a leader of the conservative part of the church. Within the Catholic Church, Cardinal Raymond Burke is more than just a name. Pope Francis did not want him around. He was a traditionalist and a harsh critic. But with the death of the Pope, he is once again in the news, and folks are in disbelief after what he just disclosed. Burke and Francis disagreed on nearly everything for years. He consistently pushed back on issues like women in the church and LGBTQ rights. He was even expelled from his quarters in the Vatican by Francis. Burke, however, has recently spoken out upon the passing of Pope Francis, and nobody anticipated his confession. Come along as we examine what the words that rocked the faithful might signify going forward. Raymond Leo Burke was born in Richland Center, Wisconsin, on June 30, 1948, and began his life as Cardinal Burke, a country lad with a lofty aim. He came from a Catholic Irish family and was the youngest of 6 children. On a peaceful dairy farm, his parents, Thomas and Marie Burke, reared their children. Faith was a constant part of the everyday routine, and life was straightforward. However, when Raymond was in the 2nd grade, everything changed. A brain cancer diagnosis was made for his father. A local priest would frequently come to administer communion to Thomas Burke as his health deteriorated. For young Raymond, these trips left a lasting impression. The seed for his future was sown when he noticed something incredibly potent in the priest's presence. Burke made the decision to become a priest at a young age. He enrolled in Holy Cross Seminary in La Crosse, Wisconsin, in 1962 when he was barely 14 years old. For someone so young, it was a significant step, but he took his faith seriously. Burke left Wisconsin a few years later to study philosophy at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., where he graduated with a bachelor's and master's degree. He then traveled to Rome to attend the renowned Pontifical Gregorian University to finish his education. He resided and studied theology at the Pontifical North American College, which served as a training ground for many future cardinals and bishops. In actuality, a few of Burke's classmates, such as Cardinals Cupic and James Harvey, went on to hold prominent positions in the church. However, the most significant event occurred in 1975 when Pope Paul VI ordained him as a priest at St. Peter's Basilica. For a Wisconsin farm lad, it was a happy day that marked the start of a lengthy career in the church that would take him from parish priest to leading Vatican lawyer. Following his ordination, Burke returned to playing lacrosse. In addition to teaching religion at a nearby high school, he was given a job in the Cathedral of St. Joseph the Workman. However, his trajectory changed in 1980. He was sent back to Rome to study the Catholic Church's legal system, known as canon law. Burke wasn't thrilled about it at first. He was a little disoriented and uninspired. However, that changed when an older priest took him under his wing after noticing how depressed he was. Everything changed because of that support. Burke thereafter claimed to have developed an obsession with canon law. He finally obtained a degree and rose to prominence as one of the church's leading authorities on the subject. He assumed greater authority after his return to the United States. He was appointed Deputy Chancellor of the La Crosse Diocese and Moderator of the Curia. He was then given a significant role by Pope John Paul II in 1989. At the Apostolic Signatura, which is essentially the highest court in the church, Burke was appointed as the first American defender of the bond. It was significant and demonstrated Burke's versatility as a priest. He was a rising star in the legal community at the Vatican. Over time, Burke's impact continued to expand. He was elevated to the position of Archbishop of St. Louis in 2004 after being appointed Bishop of the Diocese of La Crosse in 1995. Burke gained a reputation as a rigid and conservative leader while serving in these capacities. He routinely celebrated the Old Latin Mass and frequently advocated for traditional Catholic principles. Even among other bishops, Burke's opinions were distinctive. He vehemently supported church doctrine on Eucharist, marriage, and abortion. He frequently argued that politicians who favored abortion, such as Joe Biden or John Kerry, shouldn't be allowed to partake in communion. Conservative Catholics backed him because of his tough approach. However, it also brought with it the Vatican years, controversy, and a widening rift. Pope Benedict XVI summoned Burke back to Rome in 2008. This time, he appointed him as the prefect of the Apostolic Signatur's Supreme Tribunal, which is the same court where he used to labor. Benedict also made him a cardinal 2 years later. Burke's influence in the church peaked at this point. He was well-liked, influential, and intimately associated with the Vatican's conservative faction. However, things started to shift in 2013 with the election of Pope Francis. Francis and Burke held quite different opinions. Francis felt that the church should be more hospitable and transparent. He famously remarked, "Who am I to judge?" in reference to homosexuals. He even defended evolution, arguing that it was not incompatible with religion. Burke disagreed. He resisted attempts to moderate the church's position on matters such as communion regulations, divorce, and LGBTQ rights. He thought the church had to be strong. "We can never talk enough about abortion or marriage between one man and one woman," he claimed in one interview, adding that tensions swiftly escalated. A final blow came in 2014 when a report at a Vatican meeting on the family suggested the church should recognize some positive aspects of gay relationships, which infuriated Burke. Francis had already removed Burke from the Congregation of Bishops, a body that assists the Pope in selecting new bishops, in December 2013. In a statement that quickly went viral and made headlines around the globe, he said, "There is a strong sense that the church is like a ship without a rudder." Without a rudder. Shortly after, Pope Francis relieved Burke of his most important legal position and replaced him with the more symbolic position of patron of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. Even after losing his position at the Vatican, Burke remained vocal and continued to oppose what he perceived as harmful changes in the church. For some, he became the unofficial leader of conservative Catholics. Francis claimed that this action was not punishment, but many people thought otherwise, putting a cardinal in the spotlight once more. In addition, he continued to garner media attention. Burke's strong opinions against public health policies and pandemic vaccines in recent years did not sit well with the Vatican or many Catholics who favored Pope Francis's approach, but he remained steadfast in his convictions and continued to criticize the Pope's attempts to modernize the church. He even hinted that it might be necessary to formally correct the Pope at one point, which shocked many in the Catholic community. However, with Pope Francis's death and Burke's continued activity at the age of 76, people are once again looking at him. Could he become the first American Pope? He certainly has supporters. Burke's journey from a small dairy farm in Wisconsin to the highest circles of the Vatican is full of drama, devotion, and division, and he's likely to be included in the conversation as one of the most well-known conservative voices in the church. Burke's recent public confession following Francis's death has put him back in the spotlight like never before. Many have been rendered speechless by what he disclosed. Cardinal Raymond Burke suffered one of the greatest setbacks to his career in 2014 when Pope Francis abandoned him, removing him from almost all of his responsibilities and reducing him to a ceremonial role after Burke attempted to remove a senior official for authorizing the purchase of condoms for Burmese citizens. The Pope disapproved of the move, and Francis later sent someone else, a special delegate, to take over Burke's duties at the Order of Malta. Burke was reportedly de facto suspended, which was not a formal punishment but made it obvious that he was no longer in charge, and was another indication of how far apart he and Francis had become. The church views human sexuality as a gift to be treasured. So Burke continued to speak out on a variety of issues despite his tension with the Pope. By taking on our human nature, Burke frequently addressed issues within the church, such as the child abuse scandal, where he strongly denounced priests who engaged in abuse, but instead placed the blame on more significant factors. He said in 2015 that the true issue was radical feminism, which has been attacking the church and society since the 1960s. In 2019, Burke reiterated his position, saying that the homosexual agenda was the primary cause of the abuse crisis, along with German Cardinal Walter Brandmüller, and that many priests who were involved in abuse were feminized and unsure of their own sexual identity. In 2016, Cardinal Burke took a rare and daring step by publicly challenging Pope Francis along with 3 other conservative cardinals. These remarks caused a great deal of controversy, but for Burke, they demonstrated his belief that the Church had strayed from its traditional roots and that his conflicts with the Pope were far from over. One of Francis's most significant works, Amoris Laetitia, or The Joy of Love, was a 260-page document in which the Pope argued that the Church should be more hospitable and caring. They sent a formal letter known as a dubia, which means doubts in Latin. The Latin. According to church law, those who remarried without an annulment were not permitted to partake in communion because they were viewed as living in sin. Francis suggested a more compassionate approach, focusing on those who felt excluded, particularly those who had divorced and remarried. The Pope wrote, "No one can be condemned forever." Burke and other conservatives disagreed, wanting definitive answers, and felt that the Pope's opinions produced confusion and disorientation. He proposed that decisions may be made in secret between a priest and the individual, using a system known as the internal forum. Normally, a pope can respond to such questions with a document called a respond, but this time, Pope Francis didn't respond at all. Burke didn't back down. Instead, he warned that if the Pope didn't answer, it would be a matter of taking a formal act of correction of a serious error. That's why they sent the dubia to ask Francis to explain his position clearly. No one expected a cardinal to speak so strongly against the head of the Church, but Burke could not remain silent. He made it clear that he thought even the Pope could be wrong and needed to be corrected. In 2018, he went even further, saying, "As a matter of duty, the Pope can be disobeyed." Burke's conflicts with Pope Francis continued in 2019 when he and fellow conservative bishop Athanasius Schneider released a lengthy statement criticizing the Synod of Bishops for the Pan-Amazon area on the subject of church teachings. Their main concern was the Church's openness to native Amazonian traditions, which Burke saw as a form of implicit pantheism that gave too much room to non-Christian beliefs, and they said that some aspects of the Synod's agenda were not only inconsistent with the Church's authentic teaching, but even contradicted it. Other Senate members also irritated Burke, who spoke out against married priests, against women being given additional responsibilities in church ceremonies, and even against girls working as altar servers, saying, "Young boys don't want to do things with girls. All want to do things with girls. It's just natural," he continued, adding that boys lost interest when girls served at the altar. Burke was adamant about same-sex marriage, saying that Catholics should never vote for politicians who supported it, and that there is only one source of such lies, which is Satan. He felt that the Church was becoming too feminine, saying, "Radical feminism that assaulted the Church and society since the 1960s has left men very marginalized." Burke's hallmark harsh attitude, which he described as a devilish situation intended to ruin individuals, families, and the country, continued to push back with same vigor as Pope Francis pushed for a more open and modern church. Controversy, conspiracy, and the pandemic. Burke was at the epicenter of another controversy when the pandemic struck, and he became one of the most vocal opponents of the vaccines, particularly those made with stem cells, saying that he didn't trust them and advised people not to take them. But that wasn't all. Burke also reiterated conspiracy theories. He claimed that the vaccine might be used to control people, that it might contain microchips and be part of a government tracking scheme, that it was all part of a sinister plot, and that it was connected to the Great Reset conspiracy. The Great Reset conspiracy. All of these claims were later shown to be untrue, but Burke stuck to his guns despite the fact that he later contracted a very serious case of COVID himself. While he and Pope Francis are opposed to abortion, Burke felt the Pope wasn't doing enough to address the issue, and he called on U.S. bishops to refuse communion to Catholic politicians who supported abortion rights, such as John Kerry and President Joe Biden. He was placed on a ventilator for approximately a week and almost died, but he recovered and went back to being a public figure. Burke also stayed faithful to the ancient Latin Mass known as the Trident Mass, which dates back to the 1500s and is performed in Latin with very stringent requirements. although Pope Francis made it more difficult to use in 2021. He argued that failing to do so is eroding the faith of everyone. Burke's traditional ways made headlines again when he was spotted wearing an antiquated cardinal hat known as a gallarero. Burke responded by calling these restrictions severe and revolutionary, even questioning whether the Pope had the right to make such changes. Fame. He felt that it had become a symbol for resisting change. Burke told the press, "I have no idea where he got it from. I've never worn it, not even for a ceremony." Despite all of these conflicts, both men have stated that they do not view each other as enemies. Quotes. The picture went viral, leading some to believe he was attempting to revive antiquated traditions. Although the differences between them were evident, Pope Francis stated in 2017 that he did not view Cardinal Burke as an enemy. In late 2023, however, the Pope took a bold and serious stand against Cardinal Raymond Burke, deciding to revoke two significant privileges that Burke had enjoyed for years. Burke's Vatican salary of $5,000 per month and his free apartment in Rome were not insignificant benefits. Despite frequently using his position to criticize the Pope, Burke was paid a steady salary and lived rent-free in a spacious apartment in the Vatican. So why now? It all followed Burke's most recent public outburst against the Pope. This time, in October 2023, Burke publicly expressed his disapproval of two recent policies that Pope Francis had backed, granting communion to divorced Catholics and permitting priests to bless same-sex couples. Francis did not remain silent this time, however, and wrote back. Pope Francis was attempting to be more open while maintaining some boundaries when he explained that priests could bless same-sex couples, but only if it did not imply that their relationship was equivalent to a traditional marriage between a man and a woman. This was a significant step for the Catholic Church. The Pope held a meeting with Vatican leaders on November 20th, but Burke felt that this was a step too far, and they stripped him of his apartment and his salary after concluding that Burke had gone too far and was using the church's backing to work against it. Even at that time, Burke told reporters that he had no intention of leaving Rome, that he would stay even if he had to pay for his own accommodation, and that despite the punishment appearing personal, "I've never had the impression that the Pope thinks I'm his enemy." Nevertheless, it was obvious that the line had been crossed between disagreement and disloyalty. The rumor that stoked even more fire as word of the Pope's decision circulated. So did rumors. According to one tale from a traditionalist Catholic news outlet, Pope Francis had stated during the meeting on November 20th, "I am taking away Cardinal Burke's apartment and stipend because he is my enemy." Austin Ivory, a trusted Vatican journalist, met with Pope Francis on November 27th, and the quote caused a stir because it made the Pope appear angry and personal. And it also fit the narrative that some traditionalist groups frequently spread that Pope Francis is harsh and unfair to anyone who disagrees with him. However, there was a problem. The quote wasn't true. Although their meeting was brief and Francis was ill with a lung infection at the time, the Pope took the time to explain the truth, telling Ivory that the quote in the news article was entirely fictitious and that he never referred to Burke as his enemy or my enemy. The Pope was very clear in saying, "I never used the word enemy nor the pronoun my." The quote was made up and probably leaked by someone who wanted to make the Pope look bad. The false quote had already been circulated widely, but several people who were in the room during the November 20th meeting spoke to reporters and confirmed the truth, Francis said, adding that he had not gone into detail or made any personal attacks. Only informing Vatican officials about the removal of Burke's privileges. None of them said the Pope used the word enemy, and the Pope once again demonstrated that his actions were motivated by what he thought was best for the Church rather than his own feelings. One official told the Associated Press that the Pope was taking away Burke's privileges because he was causing division in the Church, while another told Reuters that Burke was working against the Church and the papacy. Despite his punishment, Cardinal Burke never expressed regret for his remarks. Instead, he gave an explanation in an interview with the New York Times, stating that the Pope obviously did not want him in a leadership position. "It's evident that the Pope does not want me in a leadership position," Zeus? Forget. But he denied being an enemy, Burke said. Over the years, Burke had frequently positioned himself as a defender of tradition, and he explained his actions by saying that he felt compelled to speak out when he saw what he believed to be harmful directions in the church, particularly on sexuality and family. Squee. Burke's belief that change should not come at the expense of long-held teachings influenced everything he said and did, and he consistently opposed the changes imposed by Pope Francis, from communion for divorced Catholics to same-sex blessings, which he felt were undermining the foundations of the church. Even as he defended himself, Burke attempted to disassociate his name from other controversial figures, including former Donald Trump advisor Steve Bannon. But his actions frequently caused division, and for many inside the church, that division became too great. Burke had previously been on the board of Bannon's Catholic training group, the Dignitatis Humania Institute, but he resigned from the group in 2019 because, according to Burke, he only met Bannon 3 or 4 times and only to discuss church teaching. God's church teaching. And because Bannon had plans to make a movie based on the book in the Vatican closet, which Burke did not support. People inside and outside the church had been wondering for years when Pope Francis would finally take action, and he said he wanted it known that he was not associated with any political effort, a tipping point years in the making. He stated this was what any priest would do with a member of the lay faithful, UTC. Despite Cardinal Burke's repeated criticism of the Pope's teachings, his criticism of church gatherings, his public letters, and his even veiled threats to formally correct the Pope, Francis had permitted him to remain, had not expelled him from the College of Cardinals, and had not taken away his home or his income until now. According to Austin Ivory, the response from the public wasn't, "Why did the Pope do this?" Instead, "Why did it take him so long?" Pope Francis is a patient man who gives people second chances, but Burke crossed a limit, according to Ivory, who had been watching Burke for more than 10 years. In the meantime, Burke had been living in a Vatican apartment funded by Vatican funds, and he had witnessed him give speeches, write essays, and give interviews that challenged the Pope's message, creating what some referred to as a counter-magisterium, sort of alternative voice to the popes. This seemed unfair to many. One Vatican observer described it as an injustice, particularly when Burke continued to win favor among church conservatives by portraying himself as the only authentic voice of tradition, but Pope Francis remained unfazed. Here was a wealthy cardinal using his Vatican position to oppose the very leadership he had sworn to obey. In the end, Pope Francis made it clear that this was not about retaliation, but about preserving unity in the church, and the controversy surrounding Cardinal Burke may have finally peaked. He made the decision in private, not making the announcement in public, and the news only surfaced after it was leaked, probably by someone who wanted to spin the tale. Now that the Pope has passed away, the focus is on what will happen to the church, and who will be in charge of it. What happens when a pope passes away? The Catholic Church goes through a period of preparation and mourning, but behind the scenes, a crucial process called a conclave starts. In order to select the next pope, the Church brings together cardinals from all over the world. Only cardinals under the age of 80 are eligible to vote or be elected, and currently there are 138 cardinals who meet this requirement. They will be imprisoned inside the Vatican for 2 or 3 weeks, meeting in secret in the Sistine Chapel during this time. Pope Francis was chosen in 2013 after Pope Benedict XVI resigned due to poor health, the first papal resignation in 600 years. Now, following his death on Easter Monday at the age of 88, the Church is getting ready to elect a new leader once more. There, they will cast votes repeatedly until one man receives at least 2/3 of the vote and agrees to lead the Church. Cardinal Raymond Burke, who is 76 years old and from Wisconsin, USA, is one name that is receiving a lot of attention. He has long been well known for his conservative views and his adamant opposition to the changes that Pope Francis has brought about, such as granting communion to divorced Catholics and taking a more lenient stance on LGBTQ rights. Burke was the Archbishop of St. Louis before being taken to Rome by Pope Benedict XVI. who appointed him prefect of the Apostolic Signatura, the Catholic Church's highest court. However, when Pope Francis took over, he removed Burke from the influential group of bishops in 2013. Burke, who frequently criticized the Pope's ideas, particularly those that made the Church appear more open and inclusive, was also removed from the Church's highest court the following year. Now, as a new conclave draws near, Burke's name is making headlines again, and he has a surprising ally in Donald Trump. What's next for Cardinal Burke? Burke is not alone. A number of names are being considered, and they represent different facets of the Church. Some are progressive, while others are more traditional, such as Cardinal Proin, a moderate who has been the Secretary of State of the Vatican. Another is Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, who is regarded as being close to Francis's ideas and is known for his compassionate work. Another is Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle of the Philippines. And on the conservative side, there is Cardinal Peter Erdo of Hungary, who is less vocal but shares some of Burke's views. Burke is currently ranked 6th among the front-runners. What sets him apart, however, is the political support he is receiving. Donald Trump, who is currently in his second term as U.S. president, has hailed Burke as a champion of traditional Catholic values, a level of political support that is uncommon in church affairs and has sparked controversy. If Burke is elected, it would represent a significant return to traditional and strict church leadership. Do you think the Catholic Church should go back to its traditional roots or continue with Pope Francis's more modern approach? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more amazing stories from Hollywood's fascinating history. If someone like Tagle or Parolin is elected, the Church could continue on the more open and modern path that Pope Francis tried to follow. See you next time.